Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a massive, almost unbelievable mystery about the world's sixth largest country, Australia. Look, it's geographically enormous, right? It's literally big enough to fit the entire country of India inside of it twice over. Yet, astonishingly, its core remains completely desolate. I mean, have you ever looked at a map of Australia and just wondered, why on earth is all that vast space in the middle just empty?
So, why do people only survive on the edges of this massive continent? To really wrap our heads around this, we have to look way past the map. It actually comes down to two distinct pillars. First, a hidden, honestly pretty dark colonial history that completely rewrote the demographics. And second, a uniquely hostile geography that is actively pushing humanity away, even today.
Just 0.22%. That tiny, tiny decimal is the actual percentage of Australian land where a staggering 90% of the entire population lives today. Take a second to really let that sink in. Less than 1/4% of the landmass is holding almost everyone. It's wild.
And this population isn't just concentrated. They are practically clinging to the borders for dear life. 90% of people live in just 5 major coastal cities: Sydney, Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide, and Melbourne. As you step away from those coasts and venture inward, well, your chances of survival drop drastically. The environment, and as we'll see, history, completely turns against you.
Okay, let's start with the history. It all begins with a massive cultural clash. For millennia, native Aboriginals lived in complete harmony with the continent. They didn't have a concept of land ownership or putting up fences. But that directly collided with the British colonizers arriving in 1788. The British immediately declared the continent terra nullius, a Latin term basically meaning land belonging to no one. They just looked at this huge expanse, saw it as completely empty, and thought, hey, perfect spot for a remote penal colony for our criminals. That initial arrival set off an incredibly rapid and dark chain of events. From the very first European discovery back in 1606 to the British landing at Botany Bay in 1788, things escalated fast. By 1795, a brutal 100-year conflict over land had officially begun. This whole timeline eventually culminated in the 1901 Immigration Restriction Act. So over just a few short centuries, the native population was subjected to a severe and systematic displacement. Now, the displacement wasn't just happening on the battlefield. It was biological too. The British brought over a massive wave of foreign diseases. Stuff like smallpox, measles, scarlet fever, even chickenpox and whooping cough, to a completely unexposed indigenous population. Without any natural immunity, it spread like wildfire. In places like Sydney and Port Phillip, these illnesses wiped out 50% of the native people in literally a single year. And making matters worse, while the British had vaccines and treatments, they largely withheld them from the native population. When you look at the raw data, it is just tragic. Before 1788, the native population was estimated to be somewhere between 300,000 and 750,000. But fast forward to the year 1900, that number had absolutely plummeted to roughly 30,000 to 75,000. So between the newly introduced diseases, the violent century-long conflict over land fencing and forced labor, it resulted in an astounding 90% population wipeout. And the devastation didn't even stop at Australia's borders. During World War I, British rulers sent native Australians and convicts to fight all the way over in Europe. Out of the over 416,000 men sent to the front lines, a staggering 40% never returned. That massive loss of life just further hollowed out a male population that was already rapidly declining. Moving deep into the 20th century, the hits just kept coming. During World War II, Northern Australia was hit by over 90 Japanese air attacks. Plus, you have to remember that decades earlier in 1901, the government had put the White Australia policy into effect. That policy severely restricted non-white and Asian immigrants, so the growth of any diverse population was legally and physically locked out for decades. Today, that history is permanently etched right into modern demographics. Out of the 26 million residents living in Australia right now, only 3.8% are native Aboriginals. So that steep historical decline definitely explains why the continent was emptied out in the past. But what about right now? I mean, with a rebounding modern population today, what is it about the physical Earth itself that still keeps humanity so restricted? Well, even with a modern population that might want to expand, the continent actively fights back. The geography is just spectacularly unforgiving. Australia is basically split up into 3 incredibly harsh geographic zones that make large-scale survival and farming in the interior practically impossible.
Let's break down exactly why this land is so hostile. So, you've got three distinct regions: the Western Plateau, the Central Lowlands, and the Eastern Highlands. But hey, don't let the somewhat calm names fool you. Each of these zones brings its own highly lethal set of meteorological and geological challenges. Let's look at the mechanics behind them, starting out west.
First up, the massive Western Plateau. The chain reaction for why 70% of Australia is pure desert is actually pretty fascinating. It all starts with freezing cold water from Antarctica sitting right off the southern coast. Because that ocean water is so incredibly cold, it doesn't evaporate easily, which means rain clouds just don't form. Combine that lack of clouds with absolutely no high southern mountain ranges to trap whatever rare moisture there is, and boom, you are left with a massive, parched, completely barren desert covering 2/3 of the country.
And this extreme lack of water is way more than just a geographic quirk. It's a staggering economic burden. The drought conditions there are so intense that they cost the Australian cropping industry about $1.1 billion in losses every single year. You simply can't build thriving, expanding cities inward when just trying to grow food is that financially devastating.
You might think, well, surely the center is a bit better, right? Nope. Unfortunately, the Central Lowlands won't let you farm either. This area sits on top of rocks that are literally millions of years old. Over time, these ancient rocks naturally break down and dissolve incredibly high amounts of salt straight into the river systems. This makes the flowing water highly saline. It's totally toxic to agriculture and completely undrinkable for humans. And finally, that brings us to the green Eastern Highlands. Because Australia sits just below the equator, intense planetary trade winds constantly slam warm Pacific water and heavy rain clouds into the eastern coast. But here's the catch. The Great Dividing Range Mountains completely block those clouds from moving inward, dumping all the rain right on the outer edge. Meanwhile, that warm water piles up in the ocean, creating a literal pressure cooker. And that pressure cooker unleashes massive floods and triggers 2 to 3 highly destructive cyclones every single year.
So, pulling it all together, considering the tragic 90% population wipeout of the historical past and the extreme weather mechanics of the present, from freezing cloudless oceans and toxic salty rivers to devastating cyclone engines, we are left with a pretty profound question. Which factor truly emptied this massive continent? Did a dark colonial history or a brutal, unforgiving geography play the bigger role in keeping the world's sixth largest country 95% empty? It is a complex balance of history and earth science, and honestly, a fascinating mystery to ponder.